The disappointment of the relationship with my dad was really highlighted when Jeffrey was born, our oldest, and the other three kids were born. It was then that I began to really realize what I had missed out on. It was then that I wrestled with this idea that my dad had, honestly, he had made a choice between alcoholism and his wife and his children. One of my first times of disappointment was when I was 5 years old, and we were pretty poor, and my parents had sacrificed and bought me a bike. And my dad brought home the bike for my 5th birthday, and when he came home, though, he was drunk. A time of celebration ended up being really just a time of pain and disappointment, because what he did is he came home, gives me my bike, it's late at night, I'm in bed already, and he forces me to get up, learn to ride the bike. And so I just had to get up and just do it, or else, face the wrath and the consequences of a drunk dad. So as I kind of grew up like that, and honestly, even just the idea, a dad is supposed to protect. And I understood that once I started having children, and I realized I'd spent my whole childhood, my whole even part of my adult life in not feeling that protection. And so as we had our children and started our family, that was when the reality of my dad did not do those things. He didn't protect, he didn't care, and as a matter of fact, he was just a threat. He was a threat in our lives. And so I spent a better part even of my young adult years dealing with the bondage, really, that it had become of disappointment and the fear. One time he knew where we lived, and he had broken into our back door. He broke in through a window, and I spent the rest of my teenage years and my adult years making sure that I was always prepared for him, even though I knew he didn't know any longer where we lived. But I would go to sleep at night, I'd make sure that I was facing the door. I was making sure I would face the window, and so that if he should come in, I would be ready for him. And it was really only about 18 years ago probably that I really began to deal with, and the Lord began to show me that's not a normal life, and that wasn't normal, and I did not have to stay in that place of bondage to that disappointment or to those fears, and that God had freedom for me. Even just the freedom of not having to look at the door anymore. I remember waking up one night thinking, wait, I don't think about that anymore. And I had the opportunity actually just to forgive my dad and to realize, he was repeating a pattern that he had lived in as well. And so I began to just delve into the Word of God and trust that the cross was big enough for my disappointment. The cross was big enough. And God has been faithful, and he became a father to me. And honestly, throughout life, there were different men that God had in my pathway that I could look to, and I'd go, I want to be like that. That's the one I want to be like. And so I was able to release and forgive my dad, and the pain and the disappointment, his not being there, his lack of care. And as I began to release those things and confess them to the Lord, it was then that I began to experience the depth of the Lord's forgiveness for me, and even what he had for my dad. And I began to walk in the freedom that Jesus had for me.